Alright guys, I know how this is gonna sound, but I really didn't want to make another video about this show. For the last few weeks I've been really mulling that over, because I keep finding that I have a lot to say, but the passion just isn't there. It hasn't been for several years. However, the finale just about annoyed me enough that I think I have it in me for one more, so here goes. The Bad Batch just wrapped up its third season, and with that, it's limped its way to a predictably anticlimactic end. And now we all get to bear witness to the simpering conclusion of something that once held such promise. I should make it clear before I start this review that I don't think this show is bad. I never have. I've always maintained that it's a series riddled with mediocrity, which is especially frustrating given the mountains of potential that it has. Not only did it have the unique opportunity to explore the final days of the Clone Army following Revenge of the Sith, showing us where they ended up, how and why they were fizzled out, and how the clones were forced to cope with their lives without a war to fight. It also had the chance to really show us the beginnings of this new galactic empire that we've come to know so well, to show us a version of this regime in its infancy and depict a world reacting to power changing hands. Fans of the show will tell you that it did all that, and they're not technically wrong. All of that subject matter is technically explored in this series, but that's kind of what I'm getting at here in this review. The Bad Batch is the textbook definition of a show that is technically a story. There are technically character beats and emotional payoffs, and some of them even technically go on arcs. But there's a very distinct artificiality that's plagued this show since the beginning and stuck with it all the way to its mediocre end. This is a show that's devoid of soul, that seems to be more interested in checking boxes for what ought to be included in the narrative rather than actually explore any of it meaningfully. It's as if these episodes were mass-produced on a conveyor belt and not a single human being was involved in the creation process at all. Does this all sound a bit harsh? Sure, I guess. I don't mean to be, and I'm sure there were plenty of people who worked on the show who definitely cared about what they were making. It just didn't show up in their work. Or hell, maybe I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt and each and every one of them only showed up for their paychecks. That's equally possible, and it would certainly explain the final product, but I suppose I should be good faith and assume there was actual passion behind the production of this series, unfortunately stifled by a distinct lack of creativity. I actually find it fascinating the way they managed to make 3 seasons of television without actually saying or doing anything. When it was announced that the upcoming 3rd season would be the last, I was genuinely shocked because, to be honest, it really seemed like the show was just getting started. So little had happened by that point in the story that I figured they were setting up for a much longer show, some kind of story arc that would go on for multiple seasons, 5 or 6 at least. My theory was that they had so little story to actually tell that they were intentionally stretching it out as much as possible so they could keep it going, essentially on fumes. That would explain why they crammed in so many nothing burger episodes in between the small handful of actually plot-relevant ones, but it turns out they had so little story to tell that even after all that, they could barely squeeze 3 seasons out of it. Or at least that's what I thought going into season 3, but what I found most surprising by the last handful of episodes was that they continued to shove in substanceless filler episodes in the final stretch of the show, despite the fact that they had so much to wrap up and barely any time to do that effectively. Omega was captured and taken back to the cloning facility, and I remember all the fans naturally assuming that we were gearing up towards some sort of multi-episode final arc of sorts. That from here on out, every single episode would be devoted to getting Omega back, and that we wouldn't have the Bad Batch dicking around on any more pointless side quests. I mean, the episode was literally called Point of No Return, and once again, I guess that is technically what happened. The next episode sees the Bad Batch going to bust former main antagonist Admiral Rampart out of an Imperial prison because they suspect he knows the coordinates to Tantus. But then after they spend an entire episode doing that, he tells them he doesn't actually know the coordinates, but he says he might know a way to circumvent that. So they then spend another entire episode getting the coordinates from an Imperial outpost. Then they get to Tantus, and they spend a whole episode running around the jungle trying to figure out a way in while Omega works on her own escape plan from the inside, all just set up for the finale. Oh, and they fight a giant monster too, for good measure. We'd almost missed our quota there. You guys had 3 episodes between when Omega gets captured and the finale to progress the story more than an inch at a time, but instead they squandered them, and then the finale ended up resolving basically nothing other than the immediate plot. They get Omega, they free the clones, and they destroy the base. This most certainly felt like a season finale, but shoehorning in a final goodbye and a time jump in the last 5 minutes of the episode is not enough to conclude a show. Nor does this 50-minute finale take any time to let the clone rebellion that they've ostensibly been building up to this entire show breathe. It happens and then it's over just as quickly. It's hard to adequately put into words just how lacking this all is, but I'm gonna try. die. You could have spent those 3 episodes having Omega escape and rallying the clone prisoners into fighting back, and then we could have had a multi-episode escape from this top-secret, highly secure base. You could have had the Bad Batch find the base within 1 episode of her capture, so that they and the clone network Rex and Echo set up could have played a part in the liberation of their brothers, essentially assaulting Tantus on 2 fronts and having a grand and epic battle that lives up to the concept of a clone rebellion. But the clone network doesn't even show up in this finale. I suppose they're setting all that up for some other show I don't plan to watch, because I say again that this really didn't feel like any kind of conclusion, just the final chapter of one specific part of a larger story of nothingness. But it's not lost on me that nothing was actually accomplished, really. The show prides itself on the fact that it's tying into the Mandoverse and the sequel trilogy by delving into the early stages of Project Necromancer, so even if destroying the cloning facility was a setback, it's nice to know that they really didn't do anything other than rescue Omega, and I gotta be honest, after the 3rd or 4th time of that exact same plot, it gets kinda old. It also gets old watching Hunter, who's basically the main character despite having the personality of a wet sock, not develop or change at all across the entire series. He spends the first season trying to keep his head down from the Empire and sit out the fight, only to be reluctantly dragged in toward the finale. Then in season 2, he wants to stay out of the fight and keep his head down, only to be reluctantly dragged back in toward the finale. And can you guess what his entire character was in season 3? I mean, at the very least, I figured Tech being killed and Omega getting captured at the end of season 2 might have finally jolted loose Hunter's willingness to fight the Empire head on, but nope, they get her back, no thanks to him or Wrecker, by the way, and then he wants to keep his head down and stay out of the fight, only to be reluctantly dragged back in during the finale. And then, after all that, they go back to Pabu, and he spends the rest of his years sitting out the fight and avoiding the Empire, even urging Omega not to go when she wants to join the rebellion as an adult. There's no progression, he doesn't grow or develop. And listen, I have nothing against static characters when done well, but when he's the main character who calls all the shots and all the other main characters follow him wherever he goes, you find yourself watching the show and realizing that across 3 seasons, 0 progress has actually been made. It's been nothing but side quests for 3 years, and I have no idea why more people don't have a problem with that. I should mention that I don't actually have any issue with filler episodes like some are gonna claim, but people like to defend them here by saying things like they develop the characters, when they really, really don't. Hunter gets none, and to say that Wrecker gets any is laughable since he hasn't been relevant since season 1. Echo remains at large. The only characters who get any development are Omega and Crosshair, and even then, it's really minimal. Yes, I'm afraid I still haven't changed my stance on Crosshair despite the efforts of many in my comment sections trying to convince me that this is an L take from me. I'm sorry, he's just not well written. I've explained it in 2 different videos now and still have yet to hear a sufficient counter to any of my points. No, it is not valid to say that Crosshair having removed his chip while remaining in service to the Empire is more interesting than if he'd simply been brainwashed, because we're talking about what makes sense for the character, not what you personally find more interesting. And no, it doesn't make sense for his character like many want to claim, which is the entire reason I took issue with it in the first place. On that front though, I did actually find it interesting how one of the arguments I received in my Crosshair video last year actually ended up retroactively making it into the canon. Some argue that the reason Crosshair stayed with the Empire was because he was devoted to being a good soldier, and figured that was the best way to go about doing that, and I of course wrote that off as writing the script for the writers, since that goes against everything we understood about his character before the inhibitor chip, and it was never actually mentioned in the show. But there actually was a scene this season that tried to use that explanation, so hey, maybe you guys were onto something.
I thought I was being a good soldier.
I mean, it still doesn't make any sense, and even if it did, it's a little fucking late, guys, but yeah, I guess there it is. So here's what they decide to do with Crosshair this season. He and Omega break out of prison, they reunite with the Bad Batch, there's a bit of tension between him and Hunter as you'd expect, though none from Wrecker because he's even less of a character than Hunter somehow, and what little tension there is between Hunter and Crosshair gets resolved anticlimactically within 1 episode, after yet another obligatory big monster fight and a stale, meaningless conversation. They also set up that Crosshair has some kind of PTSD that's causing his hand to shake, which ends up fucking with his ability to aim properly. You know, the one thing he's actually good at. Now, in the episode where Omega gets captured, what happens is the Empire figure out the Bad Batch live on this island, so they invade the place, take all the civilians hostage, and Omega decides to give herself up to protect them. At the time, the only one who's with her is Crosshair, and when she tells him the plan, he rightfully says it's crazy, before eventually going along with it because he's a fucking idiot. Her initial plan is to fix herself with a tracker so that once she gets to Tantus, the others will be able to follow her coordinates, but Crosshair realizes why that obviously won't work. work.
They'll search you and find it. It won't work.
She then hatches the ingenious idea of him shooting the tracker onto the ship she's on and following that to Tantus. I guess we're just ignoring the fact that ships have ways of detecting that sort of thing, so alright, yep, I guess that's what we're doing. Cool. Now, I just mentioned how Crosshair has been having these tremors that are affecting his aim, so naturally you'd assume that was being set up so that in this critical moment where he needs to shoot the tracker onto the ship, he misses. That would be especially poignant since it would mean that he failed one of the only people who cared about him despite all he'd done by fumbling the one thing that's supposed to be his thing. And then the payoff in the final episode could have something to do with him saving her by overcoming this impediment. A nice thematic through line that resonates well with the character. So, do you want to know what actually happens instead? Well, he gets into position to shoot the tracker onto the ship, but then he gets attacked by a bunch of stormtroopers, so by the time he's dealt with them and manages to fire the shot, it's too late. The ship takes off, and the tracker falls right into the water. He failed Omega, but not because of any interpersonal character reasons. He just got unlucky. Could happen to anyone, really. And then it gets even funnier, because the next episode starts with Hunter and Wrecker having already found out about this off-screen, and they apparently just don't give a fuck. They should be fucking pissed at this dude. Why don't we even get to see their reactions? You know, for a show that supposedly has so many filler episodes so they can develop the characters, this series seems to be absolutely allergic to character drama. Oh, and by the way they resolve the whole Crosshair trimmer thing is they just cut his hand off and then it's over. That's how they don't have him overcome it, or any kind of resolution to an arc. It's just having trimmers in your hand, fucking cut it off. The best way I can describe the Bad Batch is that it's like cotton candy, or daddy's beard if you're a fucking weirdo. It's pretty and it looks like a lot, but once you take a bite, it starts to dissolve in your mouth and you realize there really isn't much there. If you were hungry before you ate the cotton candy, you're gonna be hungry after, because it doesn't really provide you with any sustenance. But despite this, there are people who really like it. It's nice and sugary, and in the moment, it can give you that rush you so desperately crave. It doesn't matter to them if there's no real lasting effect, because they had a good time, and that's all they seem to be looking for. There's nothing more emblematic of that than the fact that there were a lot of Bad Batch fans desperately praying Tech would be revealed to be alive, despite his death being one of the only semi-meaningful moments in the whole show. Because they don't actually care if it tarnishes the stakes or the emotional impact, they just want to see the character they like again, that's all. To that end, I recognize that a lot of people like this show, I really do, and I don't expect to change anyone's mind on it. There have been plenty in my own follower base who keep making sure to let me know that I'm wrong about the Bad Batch, and I wish I was, but it's just not a very good show. It's 3 seasons of very little plot, character, or theme to speak of, polished just enough to make it seem like there might actually be substance beneath the surface. As an overall product, it never quite reached the level of bad, but that's only really because it was so unambitious throughout its entire run that it never did anything to push the envelope in either direction or take any risks. So it sits comfortably in its mediocrity and manages to be the least offensive Star Wars project we've gotten in the last several years, barring Andor, of course. It's a 4 out of 10. Bye.